In this video, we're going to be going over Chapter 3, the manager's work environment and ethics. What is it that we're doing as far as doing the right thing? In the book, it talks about the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profit. One of the things that a lot of organizations are doing now is monitoring not just the financial bottom line, also what's happening as far as their impact on the environment, and then also on society itself. When we think about an organization, there's a large community as far as who's actually impacted by the organization. Now, as the book talks about in this chart, it shows the environments that the organization is operating within. You have the task environment. In other words, all the things that have to happen in order for the organization to do what it is that it's supposed to do. Then you have the general environment, the environment of all of the forces that are impacting the organization. Within the task environment, you have your internal and external stakeholders. Now, when we say stakeholders, we don't mean stockholders. Stockholders are one stakeholders. A stakeholder is somebody who has some kind of a stake in the success in the organization. For example, internally, you have your employees, the owners, in other words, the stockholders, the boards of directors, the managers within the organization. In the external side, you have your customers, you have your distributors and suppliers, the competitors, who might be some strategic allies that you might have as far as your organization, the lenders. Government is actually one of the stakeholders. So you have a lot of folks outside of the organization that have a stake in the success in the organization. In the general environment, you have a series of forces that are impacting the organization. You have economic forces. In other words, what's happening with the economy? Is it going up? Is it going down? What's happening with finance rates? Things like this. You have technological forces. In other words, technology is changing daily, and there's more and more going electronic types of business being done. You have sociocultural forces. In other words, what's happening with the society's mores and values. What's happening with demographics as far as the age of the population, the makeup of the population. What's happening politically and legally. In other words, what kind of laws are being passed that will impact the organization. And then you have international forces. In other words, what's happening overseas as far as demand for your products or impact to your products. Your internal stakeholders are the employees and owners, boards of directors who report to the stockholders. You have your external stakeholders. In other words, all of the folks who are impacted by the organization. You have your task environment and your general environment. Your task environment are the people and the organizations that are operating within your industry. And then you have your general environment. In other words, what's happening outside of your organization. Task environment consists of customers, competitors, suppliers, and distributors. Allies, employee organizations such as unions, and then the communities. In other words, the people who you are hiring, where it is that you're paying your taxes, things like this. You also have your financial institutions. In other words, where do you get your funding? Government regulators. There are a lot of organizations that have some sort of government regulation that's attached to it. So, for example, when I was in pharmaceuticals, the FDA had a huge impact as far as what it was that we were doing. In the general environment, you have your economic forces, technological forces, and sociocultural forces. Demographics, political and legal, and international. Now, ethics. Ethics is basically those standards of right and wrong. And many people know the difference between right and wrong. The thing is, ethics may be more socially or culturally defined because there's going to be some differences as far as the ethics that are followed within one country versus another. For example, here in the United States, it's very illegal and unethical to take kickbacks. In other words, I'll hire you to do business and you give me a portion of that back personally. Whereas in the Middle East, something like that is considered a cost of doing business. The 5 most common unethical behaviors that people exhibit at work: missing company time. In other words, calling in sick when they're really not sick. Abusive behavior, abusing other employees. Theft, workplace cheating. And then also violating corporate internet policies, which is really kind of interesting. In other words, how are you spending your day? Are you spending a portion of your day just cruising the net, doing Facebook, things like that, when you should be working? Many times organizations will have value systems that conflict. For example, you have a value system stressing financial performance, but then a system stressing cohesion and solidarity in employee relationships. And these could be at odds. So one of the things to think about is, what are the values as a manager that I want our organization to operate under? Are we creating conflict within the employees as far as what it is that they should be doing? You also have the same thing for individuals and their personal life. So for example, somebody may say that their family is very, very important to them, but they spend all their time working because they're saying, okay, well, I want to make sure that they are set up and living comfortably and things like this. In resolving some of the ethical dilemmas that people run into and organizations run into, there are several approaches to this. One is called utilitarianism, utility. Basically, it's saying what's best for the most, or what's the least cost for the most. Many times utilitarianism gets into more of a dollars and cents type of approach as far as whether something is right or wrong. Then you have the individual approach. In other words, what's best for the individual themselves, which may be at odds with the overall. So for example, you may have a situation as a manager where for one person it's best that they work on a project, but it may not be best for some of the others in the department because they wanted to be a part of the project, or maybe they needed some of the information or the experience for their background. Then you have the rights or the moral rights approach. Basically, this is based on the Constitution, okay, the Bill of Rights. And really, the Constitution's Bill of Rights is a series of negative rights. In other words, it says the government will not interfere with your freedom of speech, with your freedom of religion, with your right to bear arms, things like this. Basically, it's saying that they're not going to get in the way of that. Now, many people say, I have a right to free speech at work, and they slam the organization on Facebook, and then they're surprised when they get fired. Well, they say, I have a right to free speech. You sure do. The company also has the right to let you go if you are damaging them. So the Constitution says the right to free speech says the government will not interfere. Nothing in there says companies or other organizations will not interfere. And then you have the justice and fairness approach. In other words, what is it that's best as from a justice or fairness approach to things? So for example, when you start looking at this, it's basically saying equals are treated equally, unequals unequally. In other words, you have two people. One person has a lot of money. Another person is very poor. Both of them have a medical condition and they go to the hospital. Well, the person who has a lot of money can afford the very best medical care, personal nurses, things like this, private room, all the things that are necessary. The very poor person may be in more of a ward. They're still getting medical care, but because there are those unequal differences, one's getting more than the other. That's basically the justice and fairness approach. The United States has tried to cut down on some of the unethical approaches and white-collar crime. I'm sure you've seen in the news in the past all of the various Ponzi schemes, illegal trading, things like that. And there have been a lot of senior managers who wind up in jail because of it. In 2002, you had the Sarbanes-Oxley Act that was passed, also known as SOX, okay? And what that's basically doing is saying that there are penalties for any kind of noncompliance with ethics and things. In learning about ethics, there's the concept that Lawrence Kohlberg came up with his 3 levels of personal moral development. You have pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Within each one, there are 2 stages. You can see that in the level 1, pre-conventional, stage 1 is obedience and punishment, individualism and exchange. In level 2, you have your conventional, good interpersonal relations and maintaining social order. And your post-conventional, social contract and individual rights, universal principles. With this, what it's basically saying is, with the pre-conventional, that's more of the childlike approach to things. I want to do things because I want to do it, and I'll do things to avoid punishment. With conventional level, it's more of the good boy, good girl type of approach to things. In other words, I want to make sure that I follow what the typical social order is. With post-conventional, basically you're saying, okay, here are my values. Here's what I think is the right thing to do based on social contracts. Here's a law that I feel is unjust. I'm not going to follow that law, sort of thing. So there's various approaches to ethics and the level of moral development that we have. Organizations need to promote ethics, period, the end. Managers need to be very responsible for making sure they are acting ethically and the people that report to them are acting ethically. So the things that you can do is create that strong ethical climate, and you hold people accountable for those ethical rules. Screen prospective employees. In other words, you get the right people on the bus. You put in those codes and you make sure that training is available so that people understand what the ethical codes and values and rules are and what the impact is for not following them. And one of the key things is to reward ethical behavior. I'm a big believer in the idea of rewarding those things that people do well so that you have a higher probability of them repeating those behaviors. As a manager, you are required to act as socially responsible as possible, okay? Act in benefits of society as well as the organization itself. And then also, corporations are expected to go above and beyond beyond just following the law and making a profit. Companies want people who will do more than just what the bottom line, as far as finances are concerned, who will continue to give back to society, that sort of thing. Carroll had his global corporate social responsibility pyramid, which is basically saying, okay, the lowest level of corporate responsibility is being profitable. On top of that, you have legal responsibility. In other words, in order to be profitable, you better be making sure that you're obeying the law. Then also do what's expected by the various stakeholders. And the highest level of social responsibility is do what's desired by stakeholders, the philanthropic type of responsibilities. When we think about social responsibility, we have to think about sustainability. Now, sustainability is basically saying, what are we doing as far as sustaining natural resources, that sort of thing. It's also, what are we doing to sustain the organization for the long term? There's also the idea of philanthropy. In other words, what are you doing to give back? Now, Andrew Carnegie said, he who dies rich dies thus disgraced. Well, he died rich, okay? He wasn't necessarily disgraced, and I don't necessarily agree with that whole idea of it's bad to be rich. It's okay to be rich. It's also good to give back somehow, as the Gates have done, as far as their commitment to philanthropy. Some of the research is basically finding that companies who do well as far as philanthropy and giving back have a tendency to attract more employees, have better personal and interpersonal relationships. Customers will be attracted to their products and services. And basically, profits will come if you do these kinds of things. In order to be ethical, the company has to have the right governance, all right? In other words, it's governed so that the interests of the owners, the employees, the customers, all the surrounding stakeholders are protected somehow. Now, when we think about what it is that we can do as far as our career when it comes to the idea of ethics, several things. It talks about, reducing your carbon footprint, all right? In other words, the main thing is, what are you doing to maintain resources? Foster positive emotions, spend time in nature. It's amazing some of the things that you can enjoy when you're just outside. Take a walk through the woods, things like that. Get the right amount of sleep and exercise. Expand your awareness of social realities. You make a promise, you keep that promise. And avoid people who lack integrity. We also want to be thinking about being an ethical consumer. So one of the things to think about is, what are you doing as far as purchasing fair trade items? So for example, fair trade coffee, things like this. One of the things you can do is reduce the amount of plastic that you use, such as bringing your own grocery bags. Stay away from items that aren't ethically made or sourced, and stay away from knockoffs, buying something that says Rolex on the street corner. So these are some of the key points from the chapter. If you have questions, please let me know.